So yeah, hello. My name is Tae-Eun Kim. I'm a biology grad student at Northwestern. I'm in the Rockland lab.
And hi, I'm Ann Carpenter. I'm an institute scientist at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, and I've been running a computational biology laboratory for the last 15 years.
Yeah, so I guess today we just wanted to just have a very informal chat. I think originally it was going to be like an office hours, but then we kind of wanted to open this up to the interweb and just have other people kind of listen and be encouraged. I'll just share briefly like how we know each other and what we kind of want to do in this time. So in grad school, I think it was last year, two grad students and I were organizing a symposium for our department, and then I reached out to Anne to see if she can come and talk about her work. And I was kind of doing research, reading up on some of her papers, and I came across a really cool article that she wrote for it's a journal called Molecular Biology of the Cell. And she kind of wrote about her career journey and how she ended up where she is now. And she had this really really interesting kind of segment in her piece that really piqued my interest, where she really talked about her Christian faith being a really important part of her career journey. And that was really interesting to me because I'm also a Christian, but there are times when I just have no idea how religious faith and my interest in science really interact or intersect. I don't know what it's like for my faith to drive my science or how I should think about career and things like that. And so I just reached out to Anne by email to see if we can just talk about it, just hear her story, pick her brain about it, ask for advice. And she said yes. And so here we are. And so I think some of the questions that I have kind of coalesce, I guess, into kind of three general ideas. I guess one is like doing research as a Christian, and then kind of what it looks like to be a Christian in the workplace in science. And then if we have time, we can just talk a little bit about how we think faith and science interact with each other. And so I think that's kind of the questions I have. But I guess before we start, maybe we can kind of talk about our current research interests and maybe our faith background. So
yeah, sure.
Yeah,
so thanks for reaching out. I think it's really great. I really appreciate you being open to recording it, because I think when I was early in my career, it would have been really nice to hear from some senior people and just really honestly any other people that have a strong faith background and who were willing to kind of talk about how they integrate it. So I'm by no means an expert, and I guess you are not either, but hopefully together we can say some things today that might be useful to others to hear. So my background in research interests, I have a background in cell biology and a love of microscopy, and my entire career, however, has turned computational. So the past 15 years, I've led a group that's working on creating software to analyze images of cells. And in that process, we've become more and more engrossed in machine learning and really all the computational AI aspects of that. And now we're really focused on using software that can analyze images that can help us to identify drugs for all kinds of different diseases. And because we're focused on a technology, we get to work on all kinds of diseases. It's very broad in that respect. So I get to expose to a lot of different kinds of biological areas, which I really love. And how about you? I don't know as much about your research.
Yeah, so my project is on just studying the determinants of protein folding stability using synthetic mini proteins as a model. So I do a combination of wet lab and dry lab. I dabble with machine learning. I'm still learning how that works. Definitely, I started coding once I joined the lab, and so it's all new and just trying to figure out what that is. But it's been fun, just learning. Definitely a different part of science than where you are. So that's really cool. And I think some of the questions I have may be tied to directly to kind of your research interests as well. And so it's really great that you were able to kind of provide that background. Yeah, I wanted to ask maybe a slight pivot, but I think it'll kind of come back together later during our chat about like kind of your faith background. I think when I get to kind of hang out with, you know, older members of, you know, of the lab or the other labs that I've been a part of or talked with faculty, usually their kind of personal stories are kind of hidden in some ways. It's really the science and the research that's at the forefront of most of our conversations. And yeah, I wanted to kind of ask, you know, like what was your journey like with faith?
Yeah, it's definitely a question that other scientists do not ask me very often at all. I'm in fact, perhaps this may be the first time, and I have had the same experience as you, where the world of science tends to be really generally, I don't know how to say it, because I think it's generally a positive thing. It's sort of impersonal in the sense that when you meet with other scientists, you tend to really dig in very quickly on the content, the scientific content of what you want to talk about. And there's much less about your personal life in general. And so I don't think it's anything necessarily against faith or any other aspects of our lives, but we just tend to be kind of really focused and transactional about the and passionate about the science that we do. So it's definitely something I'm not used to talking about. Yeah, so my faith background, I grew up in a family that was, I would call sort of vaguely Christian or culturally Christian. So we celebrated Christian holidays, but beyond that, religion was not a part of my life at all. And by the time I got to middle school, I was very, how do you say, sort of not humble, and thought, you know, this is dumb. Why would we celebrate these holidays when like nobody sensible believes in these like fluffy God things anymore? And you know, it's sort of unscientific and illogical. And so by the time I was in middle school, I was sort of an atheist, I would say. And then when I got to high school, it was really through a personal connection that I became more interested in faith. So my best friend at the time was just a lovely human being, and I got to know her better. And she started inviting me to different church events, and I really became intrigued by this community of people who were very loving, caring people. And over time, I thought, well, okay, it's not really fair to reject Christianity if I don't actually know that much about it. So I started reading the Bible to try to understand what is it all about. And boy, it just really resonated with me. And I felt, you know, not, I should say, it was a long period of time, over a couple of years, that reading and just learning more and having my nagging questions addressed by different resources, whether they were people telling me ideas or whether it was through books of apologetics and that sort of thing. Over time, I really began to believe and became a Christian. And then after that, the whole rest of my family actually converted to Christianity as well, which is a really exciting event. So we were all baptized together, which is a really an interesting thing. And you know, a lot of people grow up in a Christian home, and that wasn't the case for me. I would describe myself as coming into it from the outside. And so yeah, that's a bit of my story. And I'm curious about yours as well.
Yeah, my story is a little different. I grew up in a Christian home that was very devout. So I guess on a different kind of spectrum. It was like a very conservative Korean Christian home. We attended a Korean church in Milwaukee. And so I don't know life apart from religion. Like it was just an integral part of my life. So like Sunday school, youth group, camps, what else? The Bible studies. And so, so the worldview was very much, you know, Christian and very grounded in the Bible. And I think it was, yeah, in college, I went to church. After college, you know, I attended church. In college, you know, I was a part of, you know, Christian Fellowship at university for a couple of years, and then a group called Harvard College Faith in Action. I think when I think about, in hindsight, as I think about science and faith, I think some of the big nagging questions were just how it all fit, and there weren't spaces, at least in where I grew up, that allowed for questioning. And I think science is really about questions, and it seemed like, at least in my kind of upbringing, that wasn't allowed, maybe, or it wasn't asked. There weren't any role models that I could look to where people were asking questions. And I think like I have like really poignant memories of like really enjoying dinosaurs when I was a kid, and just having no idea how it fit
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
kind of my kind of upbringing as a Christian. And then again, in high school, college, like evolutionary biology, like how does that work? And I think over time I've kind of come to terms with it and somewhat made peace with how it all fit. But yeah, there are times when I doubt. There are times when I don't know how it all makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, go ahead, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, when people are growing up, you're exposed to some flavor of Christianity, whether you're in a Christian home or not, you're exposed to probably some kind of Christianity. And you don't necessarily realize that there's a lot of flavors of it. So there's kind of the American Midwestern flavor that has tied very closely. What do you believe about evolution? And now what do you believe about vaccines? And what do you believe about this? That's all tied up with the faith and the religion. And then there's such a huge diversity of other sorts of Christians who don't have a whole package altogether like that. And so it is interesting as people grow up. And then usually when people go to college is when they start getting exposed to these other variants and realizing, oh, hang on, maybe it's not all the same. Maybe if they've grown up really finding Christianity to be distasteful, then they might be exposed to a version of it that actually is quite appealing, and possibly vice versa. So it is really interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think yeah, it was just learning about new ways of thinking about Christianity outside of kind of my bubble growing up. Like, yeah, I think that really helped. But yeah, that's kind of my background in terms of being a Christian. Yeah, and I think like we kind of talked about our faith, like as we were getting older, and I kind of wanted to really kind of ask you about your faith as a scientist, and because those are where most of my questions lie.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to ask about when you kind of started to think about faith, your Christian faith specifically, in science and doing research, and if you wanted to kind of talk about your science trajectory, like
Sure.
grad school, postdoc, when you're running a lab now, of maybe how faith has kind of played a role here and there, and how you've thought about it, processed it.
Yeah. I would say, generally speaking, that my faith and my scientific paths have been really quite distinct and like mostly incidental to each other. And, our chat here today is not meant to say this is how a person should be, or, this is, I'm just explaining my experience. And so I almost wonder, like, wow, it probably should be more integrated, but it's just not at this point. So at least I can share my experience that for the most part of my career, I would say that the two were relatively irrelevant to each other. Only I think at certain points, they certainly do influence each other. So when deciding to go from one career step to the next, for example, my faith and my values influence, how much does money play into a certain career path versus not, or how much does, fame and ambition, fear of, play into a career decision. So in that sense, they certainly impact each other, but it's just not something that comes up day to day. And I think it can be very different for people who are studying particular things. So for example, if you're an evolutionary biologist, you're probably going to be confronting things a lot more often. Or if you're working in an area where there's really strong ethical concerns or ethical issues, I can imagine it being much more of a day-to-day decision. But I think it's been extremely rare that in my scientific career, there's some scientific opportunity presented to me or some scientific decision to be made where I really think, oh, I have to dig deep here and get into my faith and my values to decide about this thing. It's just super unusual for me. And again, it's probably largely to do with my choice of research areas. I mean, nobody objects to finding medicines for new diseases, and it's generally considered a pretty non-controversial thing to be working on, and so it hasn't really affected me too much. I can probably think of particular examples, but I'm curious what your big picture answer is to that question as well, whether it's kind of come up very often.
Yeah, I think similarly, there's like a large chasm between how I think about my faith and the actual science, like of doing experiments or things like that. I mean, I think as a grad student, like a lot of it, I don't have much, in some ways, much independence on projects because it's really tied to what my PI wants, the research interests of the lab. And yeah, when I think about like what experience do I do, how do I do it, like I don't like open the Bible to see, oh, what does this say? I've thought about, yeah, more as I'm a fifth year grad student, so I see the light at the end of the tunnel of graduation. And so, I've started to think more seriously about, the postdoc, where do I go? What kind of research should I do? And then I think that's when I've started to think more about like, could my religious kind of convictions and values play a more important role in driving those decisions? But yeah, like on a day-to-day basis right now, it's I do kind of have a hard time seeing how the two play a role in each other. And so, yeah.
Well, it's certainly good news that we aren't every day confronted by like colossal ethical issues that require us to bring that to bear. But I think what you've described as figuring out your calling in life is definitely something that for a lot of people that's going to involve some amount of their faith and what's important in life. As I said before, fame, money, making a difference in the world, those kinds of things. I think that's where it often comes up, and that's certainly been true for me.
Yeah, so I wanted to specifically ask about this quote that I found in the article that you wrote. I think that really kind of piqued my interest. And I have the quote here, so I'll kind of read it. It's you quote, I guess he's a biblical scholar, theologian, Frederick Buechner, and you're talking about in the context of how you've made career choices in light of your faith. And then I'll just quote you here in this article that you wrote for Molecular Biology of the Cell, 2020. You say, or you write, "My faith has been an important part of my choices along the way. It was clear to me once I discovered computational sciences applied to biology that, quote, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." And when I read the article and then how you quoted Buechner, I think it really kind of made me think about, okay, how can my religious values kind of motivate and drive some big choices that I'll need to make, as I graduate, think about jobs, think about almost even in the way of thinking about, what kind of science would I like to do in the future and things like that. So I wanted to ask about how you found that deep gladness when you were doing science, as you shifted from experimental work to computational, as you thought about particular projects that you wanted to pursue, how did you find that gladness, and what was that experience like? And then maybe as a follow-up question is, Buechner has also say the intersection actually happens with your gladness, but also the desires of the world, like what the world needs. And so I'm also curious how you were able to identify what the world's deep hunger is.
Yeah. So yeah, I love that quote because it's both sides are really crucial. Your personal deep gladness, what is it that you really enjoy? What makes you alive? What are you passionate about, together with what does the world need? What's the world's deep hunger? And I think for scientists, the world's deep hunger, maybe we don't put it so poetically most of the time, but I think that's a little easier for us to understand. Like part of earning a PhD is figuring out what questions need answering in the world. And it's not so much that your advisor tells you, do this set of experiments and then we'll do the next set of experiments. The point is that you're figuring out what are good questions to ask and what does the world need? What does it need to figure out? What would be helpful tools to make or discoveries to investigate? And so I think that's maybe a little easier to figure out is what's a niche in the world that needs science to fill it. The deep gladness part, like what really motivates you. For me, it just was kind of like a light switch that I had never been interested in software or coding, and certainly had peers growing up who were dorking around with primitive computers in the 80s, but that was just not me. I was not that kind of a nerd. And so so when I got to the end of my PhD and then to my postdoc, and actually just I was like, okay, well, I don't know how to do this coding that I need for my project, but I'll just like dip my toes in and see how far I can get. And once I did that, I just like plunged all the way in. Like, it was very clear I should have been a software engineer from the very beginning. And so for me, it was just super obvious. This is what I'm called to do. I think also just in my line of work, I'm working with cell images, and they're just beautiful. They just, they just really resonate with me. It's amazing to see just the intricate structures are so gorgeous. And the fact that the structures really are reflecting the function of different proteins and things within the cell. I just find it really, it's just really beautiful. So, so for me, I don't know how to tell someone else to find what makes them deeply glad. I think I guess maybe the only lesson you could take from my experience is that you got to try different things, or, look at different things to see what really resonates with you.
Mm-hmm. And to kind of follow up with another question about like when we, I guess, as biologists, I think we can identify certain kind of the needs of the world. And then for you, were you able to kind of figure out that developing methods for microscopy, was it really big need that the world needed?
Yeah,
Okay.
For sure. And that's why I ended up staying in academia. I actually always wanted to go to industry. That was my plan all the way along. But when I got towards the end of my postdoc, I realized I had written Cell Profiler, like the very first crunchy version of it. And I realized, the world really needs this open source software to exist. And if I go off to industry now, it's not gonna survive. It won't be developed, it won't be maintained. And I kind of felt a little hoodwinked that like, I got kind of sucked into this because I created this tool that I really would love for it to continue and do great things. And so now 15 years later, it's been cited in 13,000 papers and is really, a really commonplace tool for a lot of people. And that's just tremendously satisfying. I think there's a concept in Christianity, for those who don't know, about the body of the church, or the body of God's people, and how each part can be very different from each other. Toenails are different from chins and arms and legs. And I really like that picture actually of the scientific community as well, that for some people are just, irrationally passionate about images and software engineering, like myself, and others are irrationally passionate about protein structures or about a particular disease area or particular biology area. And by everyone focusing in on their one little weirdo aspect of the world, we end up with this relatively comprehensive view of all of biology and how things fit together, and we collaborate with each other. I just love the fact that that's how science works. We're not on our own. And especially for a tool maker like myself, that collaboration is something that I really enjoy, and love talking to people about what stumbling blocks they're hitting, and does myself or my team have some skills or tools or ideas that people might be able to use to get around those stumbling blocks and get to the discoveries faster. So I just think it's a really beautiful picture, not for just the church and how God's people are supposed to function, but also how the scientific world really works best.
That's really cool. I never heard of a theological kind of idea, the body of the church being applied to biology. So that might be a first.
Maybe so.
Yeah. That's a question that I'm kind of still working through, of, what are the needs of the world? What's the deep gladness within me? And so it's something I'm still thinking about. And so I'm really kind of glad to kind of have heard your story of like where that intersection is. And so
and I think
that's really cool.
Maybe the advice would be, for me, it became pretty clear at the end of my postdoc, but for, so that's, kind of old. Maybe people would like to know a little sooner, like where they're heading. I guess my advice would be, if you're not to the point where it's clear that you feel really called to a particular area or where you see a really dramatic need, I think my advice before that point is just, put one foot in front of the other, do the next reasonable thing that makes sense to you, or the thing that seems appropriate to you. And at some point you may find that you have a more eureka moment like I did, where it was really clear what I should do, but it might just be more gradual, that you fill some niche in the world. And it's also not a permanent decision, that you can do something for 10 years and then really switch gears and do something else for the rest of your life. So keeping that flexibility, I think, and being open to things that happen in your life is maybe the best advice I could give.
Okay, cool. You talked a little bit about collaborations. And I wanted to ask, outside of research, but within the field of kind of science, like, have you kind of noticed or observed how your faith is present in kind of the workplace? So you're at the Broad, you're not just doing experiments or working on projects. There's all these other things that go in the package of being an academic scientist, which is collaboration. There's, I don't know if you apply for funding like other faculty, all the other parts of doing science that's a part of experiments. Like how has your faith kind of played a role in all the other parts of science?
Yeah. So I guess the thing that jumps out most to me, having led a research group for 15 years now, and we've ranged from 10 to 20 people over time. And to me, my responsibility to my people is probably one of the dominant aspects of how I make decisions and like what I'm thinking about. And so I haven't really formulated this thought before, but I guess I would say that my faith really drives how I have tried to develop my group and the way people treat each other, and sort of the integrity that we have towards our scientific results, as well as just the interpersonal, like, professional behavior that is expected in the group. Like, all of those things are certainly influenced by my faith and values, and yet it's extremely rare that I would mention my faith at work. And I think it's kind of an interesting thing. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this, but it's a sticky situation to be a supervisor, I guess, just in general. So, for 15 years, I've been a supervisor of other people, and I don't want, one of the utmost important things in my group is for everyone to feel really comfortable and to feel like they're treated equally, regardless of their gender or their cultural background, their faith, everything, right? So I want people to feel comfortable being who they are. And I feel like it would be unduly influencing for me to like, I'm not going to evangelize at work. It might be okay if you're with your peers, and it might be fine to exude about your faith when you're with your peers. But I feel really different about a situation where you're managing somebody, and you don't want that to make people uncomfortable or make them feel unwelcome, or just feel like there might be favoritism or anything like that. So I feel that's something I really struggle with, because I feel it's really odd that it's quite possible, apart from this video, if they see it, most people in my group probably have no idea about my faith, like what it is or how it affects things. But certainly behind the scenes, in the way that we resolve conflicts in the lab, and the way that I make decisions about things, of course, it's got this huge influence on what the group has become.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a supervisor, I'm a student. So it's really cool to kind of see, behind the scenes, how you do things, in light of your faith. Yeah, I think it's something I think about a lot of, whether my interactions with my peers, my lab mates, is driven by my faith, or if it's just being a human being, like a decent person. So it's sometimes I don't know if it's, if I really need to split hairs and really figure out Is it, like the things I learned at church that's really driving this, or is it just me just treating people with respect? And so I have, I think there's certain like Christian, I don't know what to call them, ideas about, loving your neighbor or forgiveness or self-sacrifice, I think might be unique to Christianity. I'm sure there are, other faiths or even atheism where those are important values. And I think so. I don't know how Christian those ideas are when I express those in the lab,
Yeah.
but I've thought about, like I could work on my experiment or help someone. So in some ways it's like a self-sacrifice, I guess.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
some weird way. Definitely not like I'm like losing my stipend or anything or losing my position in the lab. But I thought about those things. And I was a technician in Boston before coming to grad school, and I remember like really messing up experiments and having my PI be very gracious. And so I don't think he would say that he's, a devout believer, but I would even see elements of like, I guess the Christian word would be like mercy and grace of just being like, I'll give you a second shot at it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've been on the receiving end, and so yeah, it's something I think about, but haven't really formulated concrete answers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a concept, I think, kind of from the business world lately of servant leadership. And so that's an interesting concept that, I mean, forgive me, I don't know the like official etymology of the word, of the phrase and where it came from, but I perceive it as having come from kind of the Christian world of like Christ made himself humble and came down to earth as a lowly, insignificant, little tiny human, when he actually had this great, power and could have had this great power and prestige and so on. And so I certainly, that's a concept that's certainly influenced the way that I try to lead the group, is that, there's no work that's too lowly for me to do. Like if we need to outline cells in order to train the machine learning algorithms, like I'm happy to dive in and do that. I'm happy to do anything that the group needs to be successful. And just having that kind of a humility, I think is something that that sort of stems from a bit of a Christian concept. But I agree with like, why bother splitting hairs, because our values and our faith they're intertwined, but it's certainly not to say that people who don't have a particular faith system don't have any values, of course, right? So people can be good and decent people without needing religion just for that. So I just don't know that it makes any sense to try to figure out where it's coming from in our own lives. But the point is, I think definitely faith for me gives me a stronger conscience than I would probably have otherwise. And I think it comes up in science a lot in the speaking up when you would rather just stay quiet about things. So the power dynamics in academia are really strong. And when you're in certain environments, it matters very much what your supervisor thinks of you, because they're going to write your letter. And, and as you progress along, it matters very much what your peers think of you. And so are you going to be the one who speaks up and says like, hey, that's racist, to somebody who has more power than you and has the potential to hold a grudge against you? And so for me, it's those kinds of things that where I feel like my faith comes a bit more into play, that if it weren't for that, I might be contented to just kind of let things slide. And yet I feel compelled to self-sacrifice when necessary, to speak up for people who are less able to because of the power dynamics.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I wanted to add, I want to ask about like maybe the challenges of being a Christian, in academia, in science, as a scientist. You mentioned about, when you perceive power dynamics, like, are you going to speak up? Or have you, during your career, have experienced challenges, not because you're explicitly, evangelizing, but maybe your values as a Christian has kind of.
Yeah. I mean, thankfully pretty rare, but certainly there have been times where it's clear that a group of people are like sort of mocking people of faith, and sort of just, haha, people who
Mm.
believe in these, fluffy religious things that are clearly illogical. And of course, sensible people wouldn't think those things and so on. So there have certainly been some points in time where I've been in that kind of an environment. And it's pretty painful to have your colleagues thinking that you're sort of backwards thinking and whatever. I think it's easier for me because I chose Christianity sort of objectively, so to speak. I mean, it was something that I came to. And so I don't have to worry like, oh no, is this just because I never outgrew my silly little religious thinking that I was born with? So at least I don't have to worry about that aspect. So I have some sympathy for folks who aren't in that situation. But yeah, so I mean, but certainly I can't complain overall. It's just, a couple of events over a couple of decades is hardly persecution or anything like that. So generally speaking, I would say that it has not been challenging, partly because I'm not confronted with these like awful ethical decisions because of my research, and partly because, people are generally respectful and generally not focused on personal life that much in conversation anyway. So I can't say that it's been particularly problematic. I think the toughest part has just been the lack of role models and just kind of feeling a bit lonely, like, am I the only one? There's an organization called the American Scientific Affiliation, which is a group of Christians in science. And when I discovered that some partway through my postdoc, I think it was, I was it just was so nice just to, here's a bunch of intelligent people who are really successful in their various different scientific fields, who consider their faith a really important part of their life. And it was just nice to, for all I know, there are people around me that are similarly committed to a faith, even if not Christianity. But since we don't talk about it as much, it was just nice to be exposed to that community of people. And I think that's something I could recommend for anyone, is to find a community. I think for a lot of us, you go to church and there are no scientists there, and you go to your scientific world and there's no obvious people of faith there. And so we feel like we're living in two really separate worlds. And if you could find some kind of community, whether it's a local small group or whether it's an affiliation like this, I think that can be really helpful to just give some role models of what is it like to be a person of faith in this field.
Yeah, that's really good. You mentioned about how maybe your colleagues or peers might talk about Christianity as like maybe like a fluffy religion, or irrational, maybe in jokingly ways. I guess my question is, how might you respond to people who might say, religion or faith has no place, in science, or Christians who are scientists, can't do good science. Like how would you respond to those questions like that?
Yeah, well, thankfully, I can't say that's ever happened. I mean, well, outside of like headlines and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I guess it sort of depends what you mean by, does religion have a place in science? I mean, to some degree, no, because they're talking about different things. They're different ways of knowing about the world. And to some degree, aside from ethical conflicts like we've talked about, or values about how people should be treated, there really isn't necessarily, there shouldn't be that much influence between the two. But that doesn't mean that people who are religious and people of faith should not be doing science, right? Mm-hmm. So in that sense, they should not be separate, that people who have all kinds of personal lives, demographics, personality traits, like we really want that diversity, in the same way that of the body parts that make a whole body. I think the kinds of diversity are really important for doing great science. So in that sense, we really do need faith in science.
Yeah, and one part, I guess, in terms of how faith could contribute to science is another kind of article that you wrote for a journal called Patterns in 2020. You talked about faith and impostor syndrome, and I have the quote here, so I'll read it on what you wrote, and then I'll ask you a question. So you write, for me personally, perhaps the strongest force counteracting imposter syndrome was my profound sense of identity and self-worth stemming from my religious faith, which gave me a sense of value and purpose apart from my career choice or my relative standing in an intellectual pecking order. And so, yeah, imposter syndrome is huge in science. I think there are times when I feel like I don't know anything. Um, and so, yeah, I wanted to ask if you could kind of elaborate more on that and how, maybe, yeah, faith might play a role here in one small aspect of science, I guess a bad part of science, which is imposter syndrome. Yeah,
Yeah.
could you like expand on that?
Yeah, so it is funny that scientists and academics in general, I suppose, have intentionally chosen to dedicate their lives to not knowing what they're doing, to being
Yeah.
in a space where information is unknown, and so you're inherently going to be spending a lot of your life in a world where you don't know what you're doing and you try a bunch of things and they mostly fail, and then on top of that, just the sort of peer review system and the grant system and everything else also puts us in a world where we face rejection like most of the time, and criticism of our ideas and so on. And so those two are already pretty toxic, and then I would say science in general tends to attract people who are kind of type A workaholic sorts who may be fighting their own psychological battles of like, I need to be the best, or I need to impress my parents, or I need to reach some level of ambition in order for my life to be whole. And like, if I can only do this, then I'll be truly happy and I can sort of relax, and telling themselves lies like that. So there's like a lot of sort of toxic mess that can lead to, I think, as far as I understand, some studies show some pretty severe mental health issues in academic programs, and PhD students having just incredibly low mental health. And when you add up those factors I just described, it's not shocking at all that people should feel this way. And so I think for me, thankfully, before I had become a Christian sort of just before I started becoming a scientist. And for me, it was just really grounding to know that, I'm on this planet because God wants me to be here, and he wants me to carry out whatever it is that I need to be doing while I'm here, right? And my goal in life is not to impress my parents, or to win a Nobel Prize, or to have a certain H index, or to get a paper published in Science, or any of these other things. Like, those are not the criteria that I should use to judge myself, or other people for that matter. And so to me, that is, people can find that kind of a identity in other things. And I think for a lot of people, it's family that, like, well, if I do badly, if I'm not the best scientist, or if I do badly at this one thing, or if I don't get this grant, like, at least I'm a dad, at least I'm a mom. I have this, little creation that I've made that is a wonderful thing. And, they have some sense of identity from other parts of their lives. And for other people, it can be actual hobbies, or volunteer things that they're passionate about, or whatever. So it's not to say that you need religion for this, but, and also not to say that you should believe in a religion for these side benefit. Like, this is not the reason you should believe it, because it's true and because you believe it, not because it's good for you. But it turns out it is really good for you. It really is a wonderful thing to feel whole, and to feel loved, and to feel valuable, regardless of whether your paper gets accepted or your grant gets accepted, or whether you achieve some predetermined notion of what you need to achieve in order to be worthwhile as a person. And so I think the science would be a much better place if a lot more people had that profound sense of self-worth that comes from, at least for me, has come from faith.
Mm. Yeah, I think those are really encouraging words, because yeah, I think when I think as a student, in my head, there's a chasm between faith and science. Like, here's like a moment where they can kind of converge, where my religious faith, the values that I hold, the love of God and things like that, can influence at least my mental health in science when I'm in the lab. And so I think that's a really good example. And yeah, I'm really thankful that you've shared your kind of your story there.
Yeah, and I feel like for imposter syndrome, I mean, maybe it sounds a little counterintuitive, but for me, it's really helpful to think of like the worst case scenario. So like, let's say that I'm actually the dumbest person in this room right now. You know, your brain is telling you like, oh my gosh, everyone is smarter than me. Everyone knows more than I do. And so for me, it's a pretty simple step to go towards, okay, that may be true. And yet I'm still a child of God. And yet I'm here for a reason. Like I'm not sitting in this room for no reason whatsoever. Like this is where my life has brought me. And presumably I have something useful to do while I'm here. So why don't I focus on why I'm here and what I should be doing rather than constantly comparing myself to other people. And I think that obviously the comparison is really what is so debilitating about imposter syndrome. And so when you take that out of the equation, like I don't actually care where I stack up against other people. I care about doing good in the world, or I care about mentoring my students, or I care about making discoveries that are important. Who cares if the reviewers think they're important, or who cares if if they reach a certain level of journal, but instead, like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, and focusing on that is just a much more healthy and wholesome way to live, I've found.
Yeah. So I just have one final question, and then you can feel free to ask more questions and things like that. But how would you advise grad students, postdocs, or even your colleagues at large, faculty who are Christian or not, about faith, science, the workplace, research, any like lasting kind of thoughts that you would want to kind of share?
I don't know. I can't think of anything. No. Do you have any ideas?
No, I'm the one asking questions because I don't know. So,
well, maybe that's it. I certainly don't have all the answers, and I feel like sort of it feels, I feel like when you ask, can I talk with you about faith and science? I feel like, well, I'm kind of an amateur, right? And as scientists, we're not used to talking about things that we don't know through and through, and that we haven't really deeply pondered and integrated. And so, yeah, maybe the answer is that we don't have all the answers.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's like a really great way to wrap up kind of our conversation. This was really fun, just kind of picking your brain, just asking questions, things that we don't really talk about or really kind of think about actively when we're in the lab. And so I just wanted to thank you for your time. And so really appreciate it.
Sure thing. Thanks for reaching out to me.